Hi, everyone. We're going to get started. Welcome to Beyond the End of the World, the UC Santa Cruz Mellon Sawyer Seminar of 2019 to 2021. I'm TJ Demos, director of the seminar and a professor in the history of art and visual culture at UCSC, and also director of its Center for Creative Ecologies. I'm speaking today from Santa Cruz, California, or rather the unceded territory of the Awaswas-speaking Upi tribe, where the Amamutsan tribal band, comprised of the descendants of indigenous people who suffered greatly under Spanish and US colonization, are today working hard to restore traditional stewardship practices on these lands and heal from historical trauma. To go beyond the mere symbolic performance of this land acknowledgement, I encourage everyone to learn more about and support the Amamutsan's ongoing efforts to protect Urastack, their sacred ancestral territory in Santa Clara County, from its proposed transformation into the Sargent Quarry sand and gravel mining extraction project. It's kind of like our regional Standing Rock. You can find more information on the Amamutsan website and also at protecturastack.org, which was just dropped into the chat. For today's keynote event, it's my great pleasure to introduce Natasha Dhillon and Amin Husain, who are MTL, a collaboration that joins research, aesthetics, organizing, and action in social movement practice. I've known Natasha and Amin for several years, and I've followed their work closely, especially on Instagram, where their organization Decolonize This Place is very active, and I encourage everyone to follow them on Instagram. They also participated in an event I organized at NYU a couple of years ago on the subject of ecology as intersectionality, radicalizing arts of climate justice. And it's fantastic to have this opportunity today to catch up with them further. Natasha Dhillon and Amin Husain are co-founders of numerous East Coast art activist formations, including Global Ultra Luxury Faction, known as the Direct Action Wing of Gulf Labor Coalition. Then there's the Direct Action Front for Palestine, and most recently, Decolonize This Place, an action-oriented movement and decolonial formation in New York City and beyond. They published Anemones and Tidal, Occupy Theory, Occupy Strategy, both movement-generated theory magazines, and other essays and contributions in places like Alternet, Creative Time Reports, Eflux, Hyperallergic, Jadaliyya, and October Magazine. Currently, they're directing and producing Unsettling, an experimental documentary film about land, life, and liberation in occupied Palestine, which I hope we'll hear more about today. Before I hand it over to Natasha and Amin, I'd like to thank my colleagues at UCSC, Jessica Guild and Irena Polic in the Humanities Institute, Chessa Adsit-Morris, the Assistant Director of the Center for Creative Ecologies, the Mellon Foundation, and everyone else who contributed to making today's presentation possible. Of course, my biggest thanks go to Natasha and Amin for joining us. The plan is for them to present their work for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A with audience participation. If you'd like to pose a question, please drop it in the Q&A and we'll bring it to the attention of our speakers. So thank you all so much for joining us today. And I'd like to now hand it over to Natasha and Amin. Thank you.
Thank you so much, TJ, for that introduction. And thank you to Jessica and Chessa also for, kind of working with us on this event. We were just talking about, we wish we were there in person. So, but at the same time, I just wanted to share that I'm in India right now. So it's really early in the morning and I'm on a farm. So if you hear a bunch of animals or birds or like my family, I just want to apologize, or not, but like just wanted to let people know. A heads up that there might be a lot of activity going on in the background. Okay, we have a presentation to share and then we can begin from there. So let me just share my screen first. Okay. There we go. Our lecture is called Training in the Practice of Freedom by MTL Collective. And as TJ mentioned in our introduction, the way we think of our practice is like, research and theory, action and aesthetics, debriefing and analysis. This entire dialectical process is the art practice. And the thing that we're interested in is this idea of movement-generated art that emerges from and is embedded in struggle. And I think we would extend that to even, movement-generated theory, movement-generated practice, and really not really thinking about these boundaries between art activism and organizing and even research, and blurring these boundaries in relation to struggle, but also additionally asking how do we live, right? And how do we support each other, and how do we form community? That's, I think, some of the most important questions for us in thinking about this practice. The other thing that, that we really follow is, as the Zapatistas say, walking, we ask questions, right? We're more interested in the idea of failures and successes, because one of the things that we know, specifically if you're related to training and practice of freedom, there isn't a blueprint for what freedom looks like, or there isn't a blueprint for what decolonization or abolition looks like. It is a process. It requires us all in it. And there are going to be a set of failures, and there are going to be a set of successes. And so with us, we've been thinking about this practice. How does that relate to us with these different kind of projects or actions that we're going to discuss today? So that's just something in the back of the mind to keep. So another thing, Grace Lee Boggs asked this question: what time is it on the clock of the world? And that's something that, again, that's also in our minds. And another thing that she talks about is this idea of visionary organizing versus reactionary organizing. And that's what we've been trying to engage in, to not just engage with the crisis as a reaction, but to be able to build and to be able to enact the world that we want to see. So this is right in the beginning, this is 2010. Me and Amin met at the International Center of Photography. I had come from India to do a photography course. Amin had been living in New York by that time for 10 years around that. He's also raised in Palestine, and he was a lawyer there and gave up law firm and was also in photography. And so we kind of had mutual interest, because my father is in the Indian Army, and he was in Kashmir, Amin's experience, and that kind of brought us together to start thinking about what does violence, what does representation of violence mean in the image, or what does occupation mean, or how do you represent these questions? So with that in mind, we actually formed MTL Collective. One of the first things we did was take a trip to Palestine. And this is just an image of, a camera taped up to our car, because what we were interested in was thinking about the cartography of the occupation, or how does the occupation work visually in terms of its architecture. And as we keep going, there's many things that we can talk about Palestine, but that was as a practice of image making. What we were interested in doing was actually having conversations before we decided to even think about representation. These are just, a few images from a project called Suffer. And do you want to add something, Amin, over here before we keep going? Okay. And once again, like thinking about the horizon line, and what kind of an image do you show from Palestine, especially when so many images already exist in the world. And this was kind of like our starting process. And one thing, the reason why we want to present, like I want to talk about this as well, is because quite often people only look at the work that we do in terms of action oriented, or actions that happen, which are more like, in the media actions, or spectacular actions. But actually there's a lot of background research and work and conversations and processes that go into putting in that action. And they could be both aesthetics, they could be both research, they could be conversations, or they could just be life, or lived experience. So those are some of the things to kind of keep in mind. And so this was, we went to Palestine December 2010. December 17, 2010, Mohammed Bouazizi had set himself on fire. We were in Palestine at that time. And then when we came back to New York, we started thinking about what can we do in the city, right? And then on January 25th, 2011, Tahrir Square had come around, and then there was a set of Arab uprisings that kind of began. So we were in New York, and what we did was basically take these newspapers from 7 different countries and annotate them and translate them, and then put them around public parks in New York City, as an act of, of course, starting with we know that media does not represent what's happening specifically in the Middle East or anywhere else, even in the United States. And so how can we actually create that kind of rupture in the public space? And so apart from just, bringing in news and annotating and adding that voice, we also decided to put this, rock on top of it. Do you want to pick up from here?
And the idea of the rock was the idea of like people having to hold it in their hands. And what we did was that cities are designed so that you don't have rocks. If people have rocks, they throw them at banks and they throw them at cops. So part of it was to bring rocks into the city and to do this where someone had to kind of feel the rock in their hand as a process of taking what could be perceived as a communique. But this is also an image to kind of highlight the part between art and activism, or art and organizing, and the fact that, you know, you can see these through several kind of frames. Continue? Or you have to move. So again, I think that what we're doing right now is that we're going to show different trajectories of the work, and we're going to go through images quickly because we will actually prefer having the conversation with TJ and with everyone here who has Q&A. But so from the Arab uprisings to a movement generated theory that brought together people who've been thinking about questions their whole life and people that are doing the stuff in the street every day. And that's, so it included Gayatri, it included, you know, Michael Hart, David Graeber, a lot of other people, but with specific questions that we were being faced by the movement and a non-representational nature. In other words, this movement-generated magazine was crowdsourced and bred by people in the movement as a way to think through questions and facilitate space and conversation. And on the left is the quarter sheet that was distributed on the day of to evade the police, because it had 8 locations and then 3 people entrusted to make the decision about where to meet so that you can throw off the cops and take up space. Just an example of like some of the questions that we were trying to figure out. All these pieces are 500, 600 words, debt and or wages, organizing challenges to think through that. There's artwork here that was also kind of by Just Seeds and Josh McPhee, but it is the process of conversation. And this was the 4th issue that we did. At the tail end of the movement Occupy, with all its failures, right, in the lessons that we learned from that, one of the things that was clear is the necessity for physical space as a place to find each other, meet each other, have the conversations that we need to have in order to figure things out. This was Occupy Sandy when Hurricane Sandy came, and we had the network already established around churches, and we used those as, you know, hubs. One of the lessons there is people tend to focus a lot on aid and not a lot on mutuality. And the mutuality of obligation and responsibility is one of the features I think is important for solidarity and for collective liberation. Again, the idea, if you think of debriefing and analysis, then how do we kind of share our thought once we've taken a step in a particular direction? Here's where image and text and writing is distributed to the movement as part of an ongoing conversation where you can think of Occupy and then Black Lives Matter and then Me Too and so forth as ruptures in time that are part of a movement yet to come that is mature enough to understand that the necessity to dismantle patriarchy and anti-capitalism, all of these things are one aspect, and then the other one is where are we going? And the fact that the going somewhere is being created in the process of doing. But this is a show that was in Oslo, so we used the funds to produce this kind of content. From that moment of Occupy until the moment of Decolonize This Place is just 5 years of trying to step away from the confrontation with the state directly to figuring out weaknesses in the city and doing decolonial solidarity as part of building up the cornerstones for formation that failed to materialize during Occupy Wall Street. On the right-hand side is a 90-foot by 45-foot flag that was dropped off of the Manhattan Bridge, again, as a tactical success of evading the NYPD and dropped within 20 seconds, and for it to become a viral image that until today is used. This is also kind of like this entry point into the imagination and what's possible when people get together. And then on the other side is, this is, you know, within the Direct Action Front for Palestine, in which banners were made 30 foot by 6 feet that understands decolonization is not a metaphor, triangulation of indigenous struggle, Black liberation, a free Palestine, produce a rearrangement of relationships that can upend empire. And so there's a poster. This is the work in collaboration with Kyle, a lot of Kyle Goen, an artist at that time, and then part of DTP later. But these are images of where the banner shows up as a tactical thing, as an artistic thing, as a practice of communicating with the world, but also protecting people, and including the aspect of the kufiya within the Black Lives Matter banner and as an act of solidarity. Continue.
So this is all happening around 2014, and as mentioned, some of the failures around Occupy. One of the things that Occupy was really good at doing was, fighting against capitalism, right? Fighting against Wall Street, and then also coming up with tactics and strategies of direct action on the streets, which were, diversity of tactics, or like being able to build the infrastructure for a movement that big, which could actually navigate the streets in the city, but also figure out, how could you map between different sites and target them and move, kind of flow like water. So while those were some of the great things about Occupy, one of the first things to ask was like, why occupy on already occupied land? And it wasn't that these conversations weren't part of Occupy. It was just that for the sake of, kind of having the idea more mainstream, these were some of the things that were given up. Right. So, one of them was around, solidarity with indigenous struggle. Another one was also around Palestine, right? Occupy did not actually have a position around Palestine. And especially when, there was around the same time something happened in Gaza, there was a huge conversation around what it means to stand in solidarity with Palestine. And that also actually failed. But, apart from all of these things, the other thing that, while organizing during Occupy that we realized was that even though within the United States, people might have a kind of racial analysis of what's going on, or even a class analysis, but anti-imperialism and understanding how United States actually operates as an empire does not really exist as much in organizing circles, and even within Occupy. And that was something that we realized, that if we have to think about a movement, which is, beyond the end of the world or for a future, it has to be outside of nation states. It has to think outside those boundaries. And so, once again, thinking about what are some of the tactics where we have leverage and we have agency, we started thinking about the Guggenheim, right? Because Guggenheim is in New York. It's we know it's one of the top contemporary, or is considered one of the top contemporary institutions, art institutions. And what the Guggenheim is doing is building a flagship in Abu Dhabi, right? And it's no different than what's happening in New York. So there's no need to exceptionalize Abu Dhabi, right? It's not that it's just happening over there. Same thing happens in New York. You use art for real estate, right? So where the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi is, where the Louvre Abu Dhabi is, where NYU Abu Dhabi is, it's actually a real estate deal, right? It's on Saadiyat Island, which translates to Island of Happiness. And apart from all these different cultural institutions, there's also golf courses. There's also, like the whole real estate economy of villas and things like that. And so it really, art then becomes part of like, a living practice, right? And so these institutions kind of sell to that. But additionally, what the Guggenheim actually, flags itself is like, art history has been too Western for so long. And this is when we can actually change that and show up with institutions in Abu Dhabi. But the question for us is, do we want to be included in that system on the same basis as all these settler systems were formed? And that's again why we ask the question of like, who builds this architecture, right? And we know the group called Who Builds Your Architecture, who's been doing this amazing work around around the United States, and you can actually think about that even in the context of Abu Dhabi, where most of the workers who are building the infrastructure of places like Dubai are coming from mostly South Asian countries or Africa, and they're living on low wages, cannot organize, have to live in, labor camps, which are about 2 hours away. And this is a system that's still going. And so what we did was think about what is our positionality within that system, and then how can we, show leverage within that. So this is, an action that we did in collaboration with the Illuminator. We did a series of actions, and what we did was started thinking about how could we actually take over the Guggenheim momentarily with different tactics. So this is the first one. Then on the right-hand side, you see, this was another projection action that we did later on, where we translated May Day in 8 different South Asian languages like Punjabi, Telugu, Urdu was also there, Arabic, Hindi, and then projected that on the facade of the Guggenheim. This is another action. This was actually, a much more autonomous action where we formed different smaller groups. And what we did was basically take these little stickers that we pasted on the walls of the museum. And what was amazing about this action was that their insurance actually went up, and they got calls where they were like, okay, if anybody can come in and stick, stickers on just a plain white wall, like you can think about like what the value within the institution looks like. The other thing that we did around these actions were also take over the aesthetics of what the exhibition was going on within the institution and make that ours. So for example, during this time, the show that was going on was the Italian futurist show. And we also know, the kind of fascist tendencies to that. And so then what we did was like, is this the future of art, right? Workers building, infrastructure for art under these conditions. And then lastly, I think within all of this, it's also really important to mention that it's not, and this was something that we learned, specifically working with Gulf labor and global ultra luxury faction, was that a lot of times the way people were approaching this situation was very much in the human rights framework, which kind of is modeled under the idea of that workers are victimized, they're elsewhere, they're in this Middle Eastern country, and there's a lot of Orientalist narratives around it as well, and as if it doesn't exist in New York, right? And that we need to support, we need to help them, and we need to rescue them. Versus on the other side, some of the things that we did was actually go ahead and talk to like about 80 workers at the Louvre and other workers. This is, in a village close to Telangana, where workers had returned, they worked in Abu Dhabi for like more than 20 years. They've returned and burned their passports and returned to actually farming, right? The other thing around this is that the reason why a lot of workers do end up going to these countries is because agriculture is the main economy, and due to climate change and land grab things by the government, but also like how Monsanto has been taking over a lot of the seeds and stuff like that, that a lot of workers are forced to migrate out of their villages and are forced to leave, and so a lot of the conversations that revolved around this was just like, how are workers organizing? And so the thing that we learned is that workers strike every day. They don't get on buses, they fight with bosses. There are strikes that happen for food, and so there's a whole living practice around building these institutions. And so this is, for example, some photos that were sent to me on WhatsApp by some of the workers at the Louvre Museum. And then one more thing is that I didn't mention was that actually one of the workers died during making during the Louvre, and I got to know that, and we shared that with Hyperallergic. And once they decided to contact the Louvre, that's when we got to know that somebody's actually died building this institution. And there's probably many, like this is not about exceptionalizing, but here's a whole system that's operating, and the art system is not outside of that, right? Even though it tries really hard to be progressive. And so then we return again to the Guggenheim, this time with, more like, actually having spoken to a lot of workers, and then thinking about, okay, these are the demands that the workers are asking for. How can we once again push from our side? And so this is in Guggenheim in New York, and this was in Venice because we were there, presenting our research and at the Venice Biennale, and at the same time, at the American Pavilion was going to have their party there that day. And so we decided to block the Guggenheim from both sides. And this is the only reason why we ended up getting a meeting with the board members within Guggenheim. And that failed very quickly. We realized, it took a year. We went around for 4 or 5 different meetings with Richard Armstrong and other board of trustees who were all real estate tycoons. And very quickly the thing fell apart, and it was very clear that the Guggenheim actually wanted to go with, the authorities in Abu Dhabi versus, artists and other organizers who came through. Do you want to start this?
No, go ahead.
Okay, so this is just, very quickly, this is, Decolonize This Place, which was first an action before it actually became a movement space. There's a show called This Place, which was happening at the Brooklyn Museum. It has traveled to many places since then. It was, it was focusing on the so-called neutrality between Israel and Palestine. And what the show did was it chose about 6 to 7 photographers, the best you can think of, Jeff Wall, Stephen Shore, to kind of represent, this region in a neutral way, right? And we know there's nothing, that image making, the process of image making, the funding of these shows, none of that is ever neutral, right? There's always a political force that is behind this. And so what we did was we actually, so this is from the pamphlet. We kind of did the research and brought it in our pamphlets. This is something that we do with all our actions. We always have a pamphlet to give to people. So pedagogy is a huge part of what we do. Once again, presenting the research in a kind of, kind of chewable way. And so these are some of the posters from the action: Dump the Fine Art of Gentrification, We're Not Tools of Art Washing. And this was the action. So what was going on at the Brooklyn Museum was, this is on the 4th floor. This place show was going on, as I mentioned, the 6 photographers, and then you would actually see just these beautiful images of landscape, all named wrong. Of course, they were all Israeli names, but apart from that, the only time you would see Palestinians, you would see them behind cages, behind in the checkpoints, or in ways that are not completely not human. Versus when you saw the settlers, you saw them as family portraits, even though they had their guns and things like that. So once again, this mode of representation that was used in the exhibition. But apart from that, one of the things that this exhibition was successful in doing was bypass BDS, which is the movement called Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions, called by the civil society in Palestine to stand in solidarity with them, which is to basically boycott any Israeli state funding within universities, within art institutions, and otherwise. And so what this exhibition did was it kind of sourced the funding from private banks, who also then support the Israeli settlements, right? So it bypassed in terms of that. And then, so while you have this show on the same floor, which is art washing the occupation of Palestine, on the same floor, you had another show called Agitprop, which was all about social justice. It had some of our friends in it. It was, starting from Russian Agitprop all the way to Occupy, to, Dalit Fight, to Martha Rosler, Dred Scott. Everybody was in that show. And so what you can see is the institution does a really good job of categorizing and separating and segregating. So what we did with our action was just basically start from, within Decolonize This Place show and go on the other side, mainly because apart from art washing Palestine, what the Brooklyn Museum has also been doing is that it's also engaged in a gentrification of Brooklyn, right? David Berliner, who was, is the president, is also another real estate tycoon, and they were conducting a real estate conference at the same time. And so local groups were already protesting the museum, right? So once again, we started thinking about how to not think about issue silos and kind of connecting these struggles. But apart from that, this was also, something that we had to start building, which is you cannot talk about Palestine in Brooklyn without talking about stolen land and gentrification and ongoing processes of displacement that have happened in Brooklyn. And so the Brooklyn Museum has been an open file. Considering what I just said, we went back specifically when they hired 2 white curators, one for photography and one for African art, asking for a decolonization commission, which was our one demand, not as separate demands. And within that, there was these 7 different options. Once again, this is something that we can talk about during the Q&A more. But the decolonization commission as a process, right? A process where you have going beyond the land acknowledgement. What does land back mean? It's not just that you diversify, and this is something that has been we've also moved from it. It's not just about diversity of the staff, but also what is the role of the curator today? Do we need directors within these institutions? What is, if we start thinking about the practice of abolishment, then what does the institution look like today? What happens to the kind of artifacts that these institutions hold that are not meant to be there? What is the pay of the working ground staff? How do you think about the boards? Degentrification, and once again the role of of Palestine and Zionism within these institutions. So some of the banners, they want the art, not the people. And do you want to start from here?
So to conclude that entire period of 5 years, when we got invited to Artist Space, and there we said, and it was on the same date 5 years later of Occupy Wall Street, and what we did was process these lessons, the successes and failures, and thought, how do we take another step? And the name comes from an action. So we said, you know what, this is an imperative to decolonize this place. And that there's a way by which we can think about decolonization as a framework for organizing a formation that in a way embodies the type of relationships and recognizes the debts that are owed, not as financial, but as social bonds for the type of world we want to be and usher in now. And so that was really simple. It was very relational. It was very kind of years of doing different things that produced this. And this is, you know, thinking through decolonization is not a metaphor. Entry point is here. But what's important is that stolen land, like these things that we shut down as if they're in the past, but it's actually ongoing and we're complicit. But this complicity is also a source of agency and responsibility. Right. And I think that this idea of purity is something that often stops people, and then they hide around hopelessness and guilt and all this nonsense, which in a way is a type of privilege because people are living, right? We're living. And if there's a political project that we're, I think, trying to advance is advancing the task of living. Right. And so, but this is a way that can help relationships and entry points of struggle, retaining the specificity, stolen land, genocide of a people, bring another people in the project of enslavement, have them have their free labor, right? And then you function as an empire for the outside world, producing processes that continuously displace and dispossess and move, you know, wealth upward, and forced migration and wars, but all of it as interrelated. Now, this is intersectionality, of course, but actually we're thinking about intersectionality of struggle, of social movements, because the issue silos are something that we've seen that are just like, it's so now within the process of dispossessed, then the concept of dispossession is, yes, we're all dispossessed, but we're not dispossessed in the same way. This becomes really important. That it's not just a fight against force and power, but it's a recognition of the things that we have to undo amongst us, right? Next slide. So this was the framework of Decolonize This Place. This is just some strands that we articulated in a poster of like, okay, Free Palestine, Black Liberation, Indigenous Struggle, Global Wage Workers, and Degentrification. Continue. The only point that we want to highlight here is that, you know, when we were offered a 3-month residency with a budget in a place like Artist Space, who were paying $18,000 a month, and all these resources, 2 floors. Our idea was, and they've never done a show, quote unquote, without $20,000 just on installment. Our thing was, there was a moment by which it's not, again, it's not purity, but does it make sense? We said, look, we're not going to do a show, but what we'll do is take over your gallery and convert it into a movement commons around this kind of politics. And what we'll, and you know, storefronts similar to the Black Panthers and the sign over here, and we'll organize. And I think that idea of organizing and using the resources as a form of undercommons that then gets redistributed out to people, artists, workers, whatever, that otherwise wouldn't have access to this, is how we actually built Decolonize This Place as a formation. When you asked us what we were doing there, we were just like, our goal was a formation. That's it. Continue. This is the walls. Again, do you have white walls? Do you not have white walls? All these comments, how can we ask better questions? For us, these banners already existed. They came from the streets. Now, when they're here, they're like an armory. They're going back in the streets. Next image. The banners will always change depending on the actions, which are the community, so that the place always felt like it was right for that struggle getting centered. Continue. Here's the banners outside. The preciousness are in each other, in the relationships that we build, the transformations that happen, and how we can extend them. Continue. Some of the posters, again, this is the work of a lot of people, MTL Plus Collective. It's, you know, a specific group within that, Visual Maniacs. Kyle Goen is an important, you know, designer and co-collaborator. There's 8 of us right now that kind of are in MTL Plus. Continue. Here's just an example of like, okay, so you're in a site like, you know, artist space, but you realize that 4 blocks away is Art Is, which is an entity that actually gets high caliber curators, art historians, directors of museums to go to, you know, Israel, which is a settler colonial project, and show them the, you know, how nice and how special Israeli art is, right? And so what we designed is like a gathering in the space and then a march from the space to Art Is, where we told them BDS is the floor, not the ceiling, and then came back. And the presence of the police was notable. Continue. I think some people are familiar with this. I think with respect to a lot of this, if you want to see videos or anything like that, you can go to decolonizethisplace.org or on our handle at Instagram, Decolonize This Place, for a lot more things that you can see. But again, at the AMNH, we use the AMNH to further the decolonial formation. Because the thing about the American Museum of Natural History...
Yeah. I just wanted to say American Museum, yeah.
The thing about the American Museum of Natural History is that it classifies people, and it's essentially a hall of white supremacy, and it's kind of in honor of Teddy Roosevelt, but it also is like an important player in the eugenics movement. Again, these are examples not of things you protest, but sites that can bring people together, right? So this is, rather than think of it as a negation, none of what we're looking at right now is a protest, right? It's making a space alive. It is actually these encounters of the things that you want to see coming together to figure it out. A phrase that Fred Moten uses a lot, and we like it. Continue. An example, again, this is not the preach to the choir as much as it is that you take over the place, you don't pay money, you see how this place could be different, and you face it together. And then also kind of the monument work. On the right is the Monument Removal Brigade and autonomous action to kind of beautify this by highlighting the fact that, you know, at its base is blood. The blood through imperialism, colonialism, and this country. And then on the right is in 2016, us covering it with a parachute. Continue. So now we're just gonna go really fast. We've collected a bunch of posters, the work that we did, that we organized with a lot of other groups to go from tear gas, right, to decolonization. And, you know, from lighting sage to all of these things. And this is the poster that called for 9 weeks of action as consistent takeovers of the museum, centering different struggles. So if you imagine the chart that we showed, all the ways it can be reiterated in a different way in relation to different types of museums. Continue.
Yeah, the one thing to add over here is that, you know, with the American Museum of Natural History and the Brooklyn Museum, it was much more easier for people to understand decolonization because, you know, both those institutions do have, you know, artifacts that they shouldn't have, versus with something like the Whitney, which is considered a modern art institution and is already trying to do this practice of diversification. You know, it becomes like, oh, like, why do we need to decolonize the Whitney Museum? And once again, I think, you know, which I already mentioned, we're not interested in the project of assimilation within a settler system. And for us, the Whitney is that, right? So how do you actually think about what the institution looks like? What do art institutions look like for us today is a completely different project than the one that the Whitney is engaged in. And so it's not just a question of removing one bad board member or another, or replacing it with, you know, let's say somebody who has better practices. We're not interested in this idea of purity. For us, it's not about like we want these art institutions to look pure because, you know, we don't know what that means. But once again, to be engaged in a process, right, which is based on the histories of colonization or on the base of histories of colonization that are happening even today. For example, the Whitney is deeply engaged in the processes of gentrification, which reaches places like East New York. So again, asking these questions. And so with the Whitney, what we did was frame this 9 weeks of art in action, which was to start from the crisis to then talk about decolonization. So we're just going to quickly show some images in relation to that.
Lighting sage, having a town hall, singling out the staff, the front end, and thanking them and apologizing for the kind of conditions that may have been created, but they are necessary. The conflict is necessary. the idea of unsettling everything, unsettling normativity, teach-ins that would happen, dances in honor of the right of return and the martyrs in Palestine, connecting it to Puerto Rico and the same tear gas being used in Puerto Rico. The students talking about in the institution of the university and the institution of the museum, both as advancing the settler colonial project. Mapping it out. So going from East New York to the museum, you know, the walls of the museum is nonsense. It's not true. Here you see the banners that were at the Brooklyn Museum go off of the facade of the Whitney. And what we imagine a different moment, a different, you know, Whitney will be. And I think that the one thing that we want to point out is that we don't, when we say decolonize, we're not saying decolonize the Whitney. In a way, fuck the Whitney. It's about decolonization. Institutions are a reflection of society and the systems and structures of oppression. So then actually applying a single issue silo to the museum is helping it assimilate or helping it be normal. And it's not normal at all. Continue. This is the pivot to the city that leads us up to fuck the police, which is FTP. Again, this idea of like you've built enough power.
Just one point is that after that, Warren Candace did actually, leave the board of the Whitney Museum. And, for us, it wasn't like I already mentioned, it wasn't just about him leaving, but it was also about how does the institution change after that, right? So it's still, once again, another open file where, somebody is gone, but still the institution still looks the same. Go ahead.
No, here's just like we on the upper right, we're highlighting the Warren Darren Walker at the Ford Foundation, his role in the new prisons that we're going to be open up. Here at the Met is the idea of like coming together again and seeing how we move in the world. And then FTP was done with a lot of other groups like Take Back the Bronx and whatever, where we kind of acted by building enough power in relation to these institutions. We needed to take that energy and that knowledge and those relationships to the street. Continue. This is a banner, and this is the people, and this is FTP1. And then this is, if you think of title, which was at the beginning, it's the idea of us consolidating our knowledge and making it free and accessible for people so that they find their path, and we're in a broader conversation. The way we may not be together in the same place, we intend on going to that same place together. This is downloadable on our website. This is the centerfold. This is, in a way, takes you through the idea of what we have done so far and how we've gone from banks to museums to whatever, to find each other, to put signals out in the world that things could be different. Yeah. Continue. And this is the communication.
I think, and the other thing that has happened along this way is, is to have this conversation between what does decolonization, abolition, and anti-imperialism look like in solidarity with each other, but how do we actually practice that in the training of our freedom, right? And so how do we build solidarity between these struggles? Because if you look at it from a decolonial lens or an abolitionist lens, or coming from an anti-imperial lens, our struggle against the system is the same, but the specificity of it looks very different. And quite often that specificity gets weaponized against us, right, within these struggles. And so how do we build solidarity when there is so much trauma and there is a lot of pain? How do we come from a much more desire-driven model versus a pain-driven one? And how do we kind of put that in our organizing? So, one example on the right is, the farmer struggle that's happening in India right now, where they've been occupying the borders in Delhi and feeding a lot of people and actually enacting care and nourishment while also resisting, land grabs by major corporations in places like Punjab, Haryana, and other places. Okay, I think this is the last slide. So you want to say something, and then we can quickly.
Yeah. I mean, this is a reference again. Shout out to Yates McKee, also one of our members in MTL Plus. But thinking, under the I think under the cobblestone, the beach, right, in relation to May '68. And so here it's under the museum, under the university, under the city, the land. And this was the anti-Columbus Day tour in 2019. And of course, they have announced that they're removing Teddy Roosevelt from the front of the museum. So that's also, in the traditional type of wins that people look for. But I think, what should be on everyone's mind right now is probably MoMA and the relationship of, Larry Fink, Blackstone, and also on the board of trustees, and also kind of Black as people who shouldn't be on the board. But that's not really the issue. The issue is that it's again highlighting for us, the contradictions that we need to resist, that perhaps the museum MoMA, right, is like shouldn't exist, right, that something else should be, or we shouldn't be there. What does that look like? I think that we, in that other kind of beyond the end of the world is like, maybe there isn't a MoMA, you know what I mean? Like, or it looks so different and it centers the things that it's antithetical to, that it becomes a place that is, we are transforming and finding each other in. So this is, again, the most recent communique and organizing is happening on this front. So if you look at our Instagram handle, stay tuned for Decolonize This Place in terms of working with other people and setting up a stage for people to think about this together. So now we're just going to show a bit of a film that we're working on. So we end back in Palestine. This film hasn't been, it's in process. It'll be done mid-year, but the sound is being worked in the studio, so it may not be the best sound, but it's worth showing and sharing with you all. So I'm going to share my screen, and then I'm going to quickly
Is the sound shared? Did you make sure the sound was shared?
I did. I think that that's all we wanted to share and bring into the room.
All right, thanks so much, Natasha and Amin. Yeah, that was really just overwhelming in terms of the expansiveness of your practice. And I know it's really difficult, even impossible, to bring together years of engagement and all the kinds of mobilizations that you've been up to into just 45 minutes of a presentation. But it was really, there's so much to talk about and really unpack. And I'm aware that there may be people in the audience who are not so familiar with some of these struggles, actually. So I thought, I could try to ask some questions to open things up and talk a little bit broadly, and we can get increasingly more specific and in depth as it goes along. Yeah, in the film, I was struck by a sense of dark foreboding, the dystopian context, and the way that you're translating or moving from images of a zoo and these caged animals, like the peacock bird of all species, which is of course so beautiful and just magnificent, but to see the bird like that encaged in this small space and then moving to the checkpoints of the Israeli colonization itself was really moving and I think very provocative. I thought we could start out by talking about art as a form of movement building. And your practice offers, I think, a reformulation of contemporary art as something that, at its most ambitious, as you pointed out in your presentation, is directed at a radical transformation, not just of some of the dominant institutions that structure our existence, but also life itself within the global context of, say, racial and colonial capital. So it's collective, it's collaborative, it's a materialization of social movement building. It's about establishing trust and accountability through social relationships. It's a by any means necessary aesthetic of civil disobedience and direct action sometimes. Or at least one of diversity of tactics. It's a matter of moving from institutional critique to institutional liberation, directed at decolonization, which you've written about expansively. And as such, right, it couldn't be more distant from the more conventional dominant forms of the expressive individual artist as an object maker seeking to sell their work in commercial galleries for cultural capital and financial reward. So of course there's a tremendous complexity in between those two poles of artistic practice, but maybe you could speak more about your relation to art, what you see as its possibilities and maybe also its limits, and we can take it from there.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to go, Net? Okay. Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, first, thanks for inviting us, and we're excited for this conversation. We rarely get to talk about our artistic ideas. I think that we deeply care about beauty, and we see the importance and power and identify with like aesthetics. But I think like part of what's at stake in what we're thinking about is like, we don't really like the idea of modernity, the way it panned out. And we don't really kind of buy into the post-colonial narrative, which isn't to say that we don't think that tradition is very important. I just think that we're in a different moment. And I think that what we're trying to get at is to create these spaces or find these cracks or figure out how we actually get a chance to find each other, to be in each other's company, to have the difficult conversations, but to have them in relation, to have them not on the same basis upon which these conversations have been had, This isn't about any one institution inviting us for a conversation. That we don't care about them. They don't care about us. So in the midst of all that, you ask yourself, well, then what is my condition and what is my positionality and where do I materially find myself? And then what art is relevant to me for my liberation, for my freedom, for me to be able to breathe? Being included in a show isn't going to help me breathe. You know, so I think like it's that really that attitude. And I must say, like, if you look at if you were there for any of our actions, you feel good, you feel empowered, you feel strong, you feel like you found someone, you fell in love, you know, this collective gasp. It's always different what it is. The fact that people can come together, not know if they can get a parachute over a monument that everyone would agree should go away, but it happened. That possibility, that is everything for us to be able to believe and for us to be able. Now you can say, like, is art ends up, I mean, people can look at anything that we do and say that's art, that's art, that's art. But what we insist on is art isn't an object. And movements can never be a thing that is represented, nor would we seek to. Our conversation is with each other. These conflicts, these things, these friendships, these relationships, these are where things need to happen. That's where the construction happens. And I think that art in that sense is informed from the ground up what it looks like.
Just to add to that, I think some of the work that we've done, I think the most important thing is to decouple art from the art system in itself, because, you know, as we know, aesthetics is driven by the system that art operates in, right? So, you know, based on, you know, what's going on, like, you know, artists do perform a certain aesthetics or perform a certain trend that's also happening, right? And we know that, as you know, the system does dictate the kind of aesthetics that get produced. And then even if we think about, you know, now the kind of move towards inclusion within these institutions, or the idea of diversity, once again, the aesthetics are still, you know, the color might change, but the form and the content and still the white gallery, all of that still is very much intact, right? And so that's not changing. The system and everything is still there. And then apart from that, I think for us, aesthetics is also about the way, you know, I mean, inherently it is about how you sense the world. And if you are already operating in a colonial world, then your ways of sensing and experiencing and feeling and touch and all of that, and beauty and all of that, they're part of the same system. And then in terms of the possibility, one of the things that we think about is art can really be a space for sanctuary, right? It can be a space for refuge, where, you know, there's so much going on in the world. And I mean, with you know, fascism more, you know, everywhere, and just, you know, art institutions, but also art as an idea can really be a space for sanctuary. And if we push towards that, I think we also have to break out of this narrative of like artists being the individual kind of a genius of these things, right? Art can always is inherently collaborative, right? We have, I mean, with any artist, you have studio assistants, you have ideas that come from somewhere. Like, we know this, like, what is the back end kind of work of making work? So I think these are some of the myths that need to be broken, but also pushing towards, you know, art spaces being sanctuary spaces, I think is an extremely important thing. Yes.
And when we just one thing, TJ, just like when we say art as a place of sanctuary, we're not necessarily talking about like, we're talking about a place in which people can again find each other, transform it in the ways that they need to transform it, not one positionality. A place where we can help us care for each other so that we can survive and thrive and resist. That's the key, right? It's not that you don't fight back, but you don't let the fighting back frame what you make and do and whatever. That's the reorientation that needs to happen. It's almost like MoMA becomes irrelevant as a byproduct of the kind of work that we do. Whitney, the same way.
Yeah, I was going to say, so art as a place for sanctuary, right? It strikes me that couldn't be more in opposition to the kind of artistic presentation that were offered at those institutions, like the Museum of Modern Art, or MoMA, or the Whitney Museum, or the American Museum of Natural History. Those are places precisely that are not sanctuaries, where you can't live. And they're places that, that categorize and contain and objectify aesthetic practices in these objects that are then put on walls. Artists are remunerated for them, even though that may not, be very much money. But it's in other words, if art in those institutions is represented as a social relationship, it's profoundly alienating.
Mm-hmm.
So it strikes me that when you're talking about art as movement-generated art as a place for sanctuary, art is about social relationships. This is you're up against the dominant conventional art system that is telling us and attempting to reaffirm and perpetuate at every turn through all of its conventions and institutions that art is exactly not that. But I think there's so many people out there who are longing for a different kind of world to live in. And ultimately, maybe this is what your practice is doing, it's even inappropriate to call it a practice. It's like a form of life. It strikes me that you're trying to introduce here that isn't containable, that isn't objectifiable or commodifiable. So that really is, at its most ambitious, because I was listening to your presentation. It's just, there's so much to talk about. And you're involved in so many different kinds of aesthetic presentations, so many different mediums, so many different practices and struggles. It's maybe, at a certain point, we come up against our own institutions of thinking, like art historically or in relationship to art institutions. And that itself is part of what you're trying to do, is to decolonize our thinking.
I think that's why, it's important for the journeys that we take that bring us to this moment. But I think even if, being radical is never being in the same position. Like, you're always evolving, you're moving, what is even a radical act right now, like taking a bridge, can be radical today, not radical tomorrow, right? So how do we think about what we do? How do we break binaries? Because when you talked about disobedience, I wrote a note about epistemological disobedience. I think that there's something like just key tools that have to do with the mind and the imagination. This is, again, I'm quoting a lot of different people, so I don't necessarily take credit. I'm not taking credit for it, but like this idea of like imagination and imagining. What's interesting is to imagine what already exists. Like, just imagine that, right? Don't imagine the shit that you want to bring into the world. And I think it's really important because we're isolated, alienated, time and space further contained through your cell phone, and managed, right? The government, like a government, its function isn't the same as 20 years ago, right? So how does that change in terms of your struggle for freedom? What does it mean to go to NYU, for me to teach at NYU, for my students to get into debt, and I teach them about freedom? Right. So what we're talking about isn't separate from us, which is another term that, what you're hearing is a lot of ideas that we're coming into this new year with, right? From our failure. How do we move forward? How do we move alongside? And I think that, we've said it, but we didn't say it enough. I think that we are refusing the way the world is. But that refusal is not a negation. It's both a negation and an affirmation. It creates that space of the break that can allow for other things to happen, right? So when you are going into MoMA or the Whitney and transforming it, what you're doing is, as a byproduct, you're refusing it, but you're not protesting the Whitney. Fuck the Whitney. You're actually going to a place that you're creating conditions that otherwise don't exist to see each other. And if we see each other, then maybe we'll know a little bit more about what's happening with each other. And if we know about what's happening with each other, we can figure out how to change it.
And that's crucial,
gives us
right?
it just basically gives us the option of creating these little pockets of time that are outside of this colonial time and space. The other thing that we really don't believe is in the linearity of time either. So it's kind of like a spaceship kind of a project as well. So like, not really following the timeline of progress and development. And so we can keep going back to the same institutions in different ways, but like, coming together in different groups, kind of like, building these relationships. I think like the idea of relationality is at the core of it. And then the other thing I would add is like, apart from thinking about decolonization as this like mind-body process, I think what's really important is how do you center land, water, and air to that. And I think that because otherwise, as in many indigenous scholars and people have told us that it becomes a shell game, right? If you're just thinking about it from that context. So how do art institutions? So it's not just about decolonization of your archives or of your shows or your exhibitions, but it's from the land where you are, and how do you start from that? And so I think those, and then that is a living practice, right? The moment you start thinking about land, it is a living practice. You have to actually acknowledge what's next door, what you're on, what's underneath. And I think the water, all of that, I think it completely changes the equation of even what then an art institution means.
Yeah.
I think one thing just to add to this, because I know that you all talked also about socialism or these kind of isms, we stay away from that, but like, these are not antithetical. I think the issue is this: our relationship to property is presupposed in all three isms, capitalism, socialism. There's a relationship to property. Is it public? Is it private? These kind of things. What we're interested in, and this is why I started with post-coloniality. Post-coloniality still retains, or post-colonialism still retains the West as a center. Look at Okwe and Wazer in his very important show that he did. Everything was pointing to like, how do you break, how do you whatever. What we're interested in is multiple worlds existing in this one. This means the sense of autonomy and agency and whatever is like, I need to fight for other people to have space to actually articulate their worldview. It's an alignment that seems not as strategic, but is essential right now. So when we talk about, the Zapatistas tell us from below and to the left. We say, together and separately, but in agreement. These kind of tools are necessary because what we've seen the left often do is like, if we're just united, things will be different. If we whatever, no, it hasn't worked in the whole 20th century.
Okay, I have a question that follows up on that. And just to remind viewers and listeners, if you have a question, please enter it into the Q&A, and we'll do our best at picking it up and integrating it into the conversation as we go along. There's a few thoughts that have come up. The necessity of acknowledging multiple worlds, for instance. David Graeber and direct action, or acting like you're already free, as the beginning of a transformative consciousness that can completely remake the world. And solidarity with intersecting struggle. So I'd like to ask you about that. What solidarity means to you? If you could say more about that. I know you've mentioned this a lot. So I'm curious, what is solidarity's status in today's context? Where, for instance, organized labor, as we all know, has suffered decades-long attacks, most recently with the so-called right-to-work anti-union legislations all over the country. And there's the divisions of identity politics that we're dealing with, and I think you mentioned that a few times in terms of not organizing solidarity around identity, but rather around struggles. So I'm curious about that. And also technology, where solidarity is so often expressed merely as a social media like, in the form of clicktivism, or at most a kind of one-off protest. So you've also discussed this with the Red Nation, doing an interview for the 2019 book Standing Rock, Voices from the No DAPL Movement, with Jaskiran Dhillon, and Nick Estes and Melanie Yazzie were our most recent guest in this series, by the way, where we talked about some of this too. So can you talk more about what solidarity means for you, how and why you define it as insistently intersectionalist, and how you're understanding what you call your offering of, and you write this, your offering of solidarity with indigenous resurgence and Black liberation on the entwined paths of decolonization and abolition?
I mean, since you mentioned just Kiran Dhillon, I mean, she writes about the idea of being a political accomplice, and I think that's really important to kind of bring in. What does a political accomplice mean versus an ally? And I think it's a really important question because once again, not an important question; it's an important thing because, for example, for me, somebody, right now I'm in India, but I've been living in the United States as a person on a non-immigrant visa, right, deciding to eventually maybe live there or not. But then I'm a settler, even though I'm an immigrant, right? And so is the case for many. So then what does my, what is my role within that struggle? And I think that's the kind of like, approach that I take is like, okay, what are the debts that we owe each other? What are the historical debts that exist? And then how do we base solidarity around that? Where can we, specifically, what lens are we putting on, right? Like I mentioned, if you look at it from an abolitionist lens, if you look at it from a decolonial lens, if you look at it from an anti-imperial lens, the system looks different, but we need all of them together to be able to resist this. And so that, and to know that the spot that I can't look from, I have to trust that I do not know because it is not my lived experience. And then you knit and you build this fabric, or like you build these relations. And I think that's been the work that we've been trying to do, is really in the relationship building, is like, okay, I think that within indigenous resurgence is like, okay, anything that we can do, whatever work we can do being on indigenous land. I think you mentioned work, but once again, who's built these nations, right? It's a structural question. What does labor mean? But like, what does work mean for us? And again, you brought up David Graeber. He talks about the idea of 4-hour workday, right? But that's still, you can still complicate that and really think about, okay, work in relation to life. What is life? What is work? What are all of these different things? And so in terms of, I think solidarity, for me is like, okay, if I don't, being a political accomplice to the struggle that I really, is important, and then providing my own kind of work within that, my own lens within that. Do you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, like, to me, solidarity is a political choice. It's not meant to be comfortable. It's something that you kind of choose out of a strategy. It's a strategic choice. It's not out of the goodness of your heart. It's out of this recognition that collective liberation is a strategic choice. Becoming ungovernable does make sense when people don't have leverage. Now, solidarity, we put decolonial in front of it just because solidarity tends to be the things that you have mentioned. For us, solidarity needs to kind of be articulated on the land that you stand on. How does that relate? I'm Palestinian, but that identity shouldn't give me the fact to pass on something. Now, that seems too complicated for people. People want blinders, and they want to just figure out how they can be on the one place in which they're, the hierarchy of oppression, I'm at the highest. That produces this kind of perverse idea of like, don't talk to me, I got all the shit in the world, I gotta get things my way. The problem with getting things your way, the problem with, let's say, the United States, as being your only site of struggle, what do you do with the Black Ethiopian soldier who's shooting Palestinian kids, right? And had a right to return to lands that he'd never seen or she's never seen? That's the issue. You have to go to that. You have to go to that, not because you want to kind of one-up anyone, but because that place is how we understand to struggle more effectively, right? People are engaged in struggle, but people are often engaged, there's certain struggles we don't even recognize. So it's like the training of the recognition and the identification. But then there's a whole other thing in which people engaged in solidarity and struggle to deal with guilt and hopelessness, right? And a badge of honor and these kind of things. So when we think of like technology, no position on technology. We've used technology to throw the NYPD off. We've used technology in Tahrir Square. What did they do? They did splinter marches in neighborhoods. They had a Facebook page, but the Facebook page just said where to go. But the things happened in the neighborhood. So by the time that they came towards Tahrir Square, there were thousands and thousands and thousands of people. They went into neighborhoods and from neighborhoods to come to there. The point is that they use technology. We use technology for Occupy, right, at that time. And it was a Twitter handle in which it got everyone there. But then we had different sites that only 3 people in analog form made a decision on the ground of where to go, because we identified 8 locations. So there's ways to think of technology in that way. Now, there's also lessons that you learn, right? We don't think call out culture is a good thing. We definitely don't think you put call out culture on social media. Why? Because that's easy for counterinsurgency. The question then becomes, who's the cop? Do you see what I'm saying? Like there's, like, for example, you can have a situation in which you just like, hey, you know, I want to kill cops. All right. Well, if we saw something like that on our Instagram, we would tell someone, don't say that. Not because we're taking a position on cops and what abolition and what that is, but that someone that says that on our social media with a lot of other people just liking it creates a whole dynamic of like the police is looking, they can identify certain people, the police may have put that, we don't know, right? So thinking about technology, and we use technology, right? But you have to use technology in a way that makes sense to the kind of world that you want to live now.
I mean, just to add, I mean, I think technology is not just a new form. We can think like fire is a technology. So I don't really think that we should think of technology in the way that the market actually talks about technology. Because I think once again, like, you know, what we see with Facebook, social, you know, all of this is it's corporate control over technology, right? And versus you can actually have technology for the people, by the people, and really rethink the ways you operate within that. And, you know, we do have, you know, for example, within, you know, these movements, you have a lot of practitioners moving outside of the systems, like, you know, people are building mesh networks. There's other ways of building technology that is for the community, and we're trying to figure out what role does media have. You know, like for the same example that, you know, Simone Brown has told us, surveillance has always existed. It doesn't come in from NSA or like, you know, just having our smartphones. So it's the logic of technology. Once again, it's the logic of colonization. I mean, we know that artificial intelligence at this point is racist because white men are making it in Silicon Valley, right? This is something that like, it's not astonishing that these things they're based on the same structures that already exist. And so technology, like art, is no different in that way, right? And so once again, if you can think of movement generated art, you can also think of movement generated media, technology, things like that. So it's just a complete reorientation around the way we think about these things. And then, you know, technology kind of blurs in with art and kind of goes somewhere else, and it means something completely different. And I think that's the reorientation that we need to kind of work towards. And it really is both on the bodily level, but also, you know, just the kind of collective and the relations that kind of come together.
And then in terms of identity politics, TJ, because I think I take notes of like things that you were, you know, I like Magnolo's distinction between identity politics and a politics of identity. If people are organizing around how they look in identities that they claim in general, and then they find other people like them, you're going to face the problem that Fanon talked about. You're going to face the problem that Palestinians talked about, that are experiencing right now. Leadership speaking on behalf of you because they look like you is the end of your struggle. Now, there's a complexity there, because on the one hand, I would never go and say to Black folks, hey, this person isn't that, this person is that. But we have chosen who our people are, right? We have chosen who we work with. We don't work with NGOs. We don't work with whatever. It doesn't matter to us that a march is led by, you know, a trans Black person. That's not the end of the analysis, and it shouldn't be, right? But you have to also do the work, right? For us, Black liberation and abolition, decolonization and indigenous sovereignty from where we are on occupied land in New York is essential to any move in the world. Not
and
out of
so
the goodness
dismantling patriarchy, which
yes,
yeah.
through all of it, right? But then I would say that in addition, free Palestine. Now, why free Palestine? This isn't a laundry list. This is like, we live in a Zionist society, especially when it comes to the art world and art system, especially when it comes to New York City. And we're going to say that, and we're going to say it even when they make it illegal to say it. And finally, on the issue of solidarity, it must be unconditional. It must be. It's the idea of dispossessed people policing each other is ridiculous, as if they have the power and as if we behave as civilized, then everything will be fine.
I like Astor Taylor's definition of solidarity as involving the socialization of debt, where we realize that we're better off weathering the storm together than on our own as, isolated, again, atomized individuals. But I like how you're expressing it as a choice, something that necessarily involves work. It's difficult and challenging, and it involves complicity and recognizing one's own privileges and positionality in relationship to all of these systems of oppression, and realizing that that I can't be free until everyone else is free, and that's ultimately that's not containable. In the same way that someone like Angela Davis talks about it. There's no way to choose our solidarities in a limiting way, because it's simply ultimately contradictory. So she has some amazing quote. What is it? That it's just that solidarity is indivisible, ultimately. And so you can't exceptionalize Palestine and say everything. I'm in solidarity with everything except that. Because we know that Palestine particularly is really difficult. Like, it's the third rail of progressive politics in this country. So I think that's really key what you're bringing out there. I'm also just cognizant of the time, and I know things are passing really quickly. You've answered some of my questions. There's still so much to talk about. Let me throw in a question from the audience. Aaron Katzman, he asks, you mentioned a few times about thinking and acting beyond the state. Right? Could you explain what this beyond means and entails, and how it might work toward the dissolution or decolonization of existing settler states?
Yeah, I mean, beyond the state, if you look at the direct action of deoccupation of at that time Occupy Wall Street, that was beyond the state. Right? It actually ignores the state and enacts the kind of world that you want to see. It has all the problems and societal wounds, except the difference is that people now are addressing them rather than hiding them and saying it's not my problem. It is our problem. The context of Hurricane Sandy, what was beyond the state? Beyond the state was that we had a network of churches. And so when the state retreated, we already had relationships and technology and infrastructure in which we went to Staten Island and we set up in Brooklyn and we networked these things together and we offered, aid, and in the process we began organizing. That was another, the state retreats. I think someone says something, it's like, you often hear disaster capitalism, but you don't think of disaster communism. Right? So this is the communization of things are happening. I'm telling you, the thing is already happening. It's been happening. It happens all the time. We don't recognize it. We seem to be wedded to this idea of means and ends. Other examples would be, every time that you take the streets, we did this with FTP. It was essential that there were no permits. Why would you, I mean, it's ridiculous. Why would you go to the state, ask for a permit, tell them, put a name on a thing, and then they put barricades and says, okay, this is your free speech zone, go there. You have to be like, what is the point? The point is to feel free. The point is for others to join, and it's like, I like this too. Yeah, fuck the police, fuck the state. That's what we mean by that. It's like, forget it, just no. No, Zabatistas, no opens up a million yeses. It's in that space that you create, that space.
Hey, how do you distinguish your conceptualization of freedom, right, from dominant right-wing libertarian approaches? Who, these people also want to be free. They also want to be ungovernable. Also, like how do you deal with that?
Well, I mean, it's embedded. That's why I'm saying it's very difficult if you try to create formations that are not rooted in a place where it's like the dismantling of all structures of oppression as a byproduct of what we desire together, while acknowledging the debts that we owe each other, not so they can be repaid. That's the other thing. Debt precedes money. right? Our social relations, bonds on Wall Street, were social bonds before they became bonds on Wall Street. These hierarchical bonds in relation to these social bonds that are horizontal. There's a whole rearrangement of the process where I think that most of the time it's not about us writing it more lucidly. It's about us taking space in the world in different forms where we can actually help each other recognize it. The other example would be, let's say, so again, it's like when we did FTP, you know, that those actions were instrumental for a whole generation of feeling what it means for your feet to not know they can go wherever they want for a minute, right? Now that the George Floyd moment came, and that was everywhere. That was everything. That was people were doing. You tell someone right now, go get a permit, and they would lose their mind. Okay, so we're discovering what does it mean. But we have a bigger issue for the intellectuals, which is just like, what is this social contract that people have been talking about? I mentioned the fact that like you have financialization that has reached such a level, right? That you're telling me right now, a government that has a monopoly on power gets to do whatever it wants because we're going to hold on to property and this is the best that we can do. Again, we reject that. Because honestly, like Trump existed for others since 1492. So it's like we need to reorient to each other. The idea of like beyond the state happens all the time. Even it could happen in your classroom. That's what I do, right? Just in terms of the type of conversations we have. Be honest. Go ahead.
I mean, I think the biggest example is coronavirus and what happened with that across. I mean, not like you know, if you think about the kind of medical system that kind of collapsed, and for a first world, so-called first world country, right, which is the United States. I mean, yeah, India is doing like way better in terms of that. We have you know, issues around fascism which are huge, but like what people have done, that's a whole other situation here. And I think it's the same even in the U.S. You know, why do we talk about mutual aid so much, and you know, versus charity? And seeing these kind of mutual aid things, that's once again, I think, thinking beyond the state, right, where it's not that the state is going to come rescue us once, you know, we hit this pandemic or an earthquake or a flood. There's already commonality that's built into it, and then, you know, we go around with that. I mean, and the only one thing that I would say around like the difference between freedom from like, let's say, right wing to us is, I think the idea of ownership around land is really at the core of a lot of this, right? Like, so specifically when we think about, you know, freedom, I think we're not just thinking about freedom as human beings. We're thinking freedom for like all species that, I mean, like the kind of work that as you know, as Western civilization has done. You're going to freaking go colonize Mars right now. Right? Elon Musk is like everyone's favorite. It's a conversation, like, you know, doesn't matter where you are on this world right now. It's not just, you know, like in India, people love, you know, that guy. So it's a struggle right now around a sense of ideology that makes you think that development and progress is the only way forward, right? And that's freedom, right? To be able to go and buy, you know, fill in your car with gas or whatever. It's a way of life, right? That's what is equated to freedom, right? Freedom is equated to, if you can live this certain lifestyle, oh, you're a free human being. And I mean, and I understand that, especially when it comes from like, you know, not having access to resources. So then what does resources look like, right? How do we actually give up control over land and property? I'll move outside of that. And I think so freedom looks completely different if you completely shift the way we think about property and ownership. And I think that's really at the core of a lot of these things.
And I think just to add to that, I think, you know, Gayatri Spivak says freedom means different things for different people. So we're not going to erase that, right? We're not going to say there's one freedom that looks a particular way. We need to separate the structures of oppression that are vertical and then the oppression that we enact horizontally, right? There's something there, and you do it step by step, and you do it in how you move in the world, and what are the choices that you make strategically as sites of resistance, reorientation, transformation, in all the modes that are possible that speak to a person. And those conversations end up being constructive. That's why I'm saying you have to change the terms upon which the conversations are being had. I'm not going to spend time talking to a Zionist. Like, you know, we're not going to spend time talking to like a right winger, right? That's that for other people, people that look like him, people that understand that worldview, people, whatever. That's work that needs to be done, but it's all on a spectrum, right? So that what is the kind of work that we do and the kind of living that entails rearrangement of desire over time, right? Because in the context of like Occupy or any, let's say the City Hall encampment that happened recently, the issues of society manifest and they will get weaponized by the state as modes of counterinsurgency. So we have to also figure out when we come together, how do we protect each other? When we come together, right? So these are all opportunities. They're not just threats, they're opportunities for figuring out what we do. In Kurdistan, or in like the Kurdish folks, figured out, okay, here's how our transitional society could look like. In the Zapatistas, here's what it could look like. This is not a utopia, right? Concept. It's work that's done, but you have to keep the state and capital somehow at bay or create these pockets. At the end of the day, our work in a way speaks for itself. Look at the organizing that has happened in New York City. Look at the art world. One thing that we surprisingly are always surprised with is the fact that we still are, people respect us. We haven't been blocked out of the art world, right? But at the same time, we haven't compromised on our principles. We're moving, trying to figure things out. We're not shying away from failure, but we're giving it our best effort. And we're trying to constantly move while also sharing what we find, not so we can preach, but so we can figure out, okay, who's with us and what can we do differently and how can we figure things out?
Yeah, it comes back to art as a form of life, I think, ultimately, which is about ethical relationality, accountability, trust, and a freedom that's built on those principles, where freedom is not about the negation of all responsibilities so that we can occupy Mars or you know, whatever. It's just, that's a kind of very different libertarian framework than what you're talking about, which is so important, I think. A freedom based on, say, an unpayable debt, which is what you're trying, I think what I hear you getting at, which is so crucial. There's no monetary reparations that can undo the harm of the last 500 plus years of white supremacy, of structural racism, of genocide, of all the holocausts, of, you know, the catastrophe of the past. So yeah, we're faced with a condition that we can only continue to engage with and struggle and operate at the speed of trust, I think, in building these new relationships. Let me read another question from the audience. This is Mustafa Hidayah. It's a long question. They say, Instagram and institutions are primary media of your activities. Your work is symbiotic, though, with plutocratic surplus and technocratic extraction. This is not a recrimination, though. As you point out, purity is paralytic, but it's not clear whether you want to reform these surplus institutions of culture or quote unquote fuck them, as in MoMA. So paranoid negativity was the kernel of your propulsive event, Occupy, with its notorious no demand that shit is fucked up and bullshit. I appreciate that you acknowledge that Occupy failed to bring about a political formation. The organizational building blocks of left solidarity politics have historically been unions and parties. So does solidarity have a nameable organizational shape for you? And does that organizational shape support the sanctuary model of art production of which you speak? There's lots in that question, but lots of interesting stuff to address.
I think we addressed some of this in, like, say, from institutional critique to institutional liberation.
Your essay that was published in October magazine. Yeah.
I think people assume they know what we're doing, and they don't realize that we're starting from a different place and we're going to a different place. So for example, you know, I'm Palestinian. I do what I do here because I care about a home that I can't go back to, or a home in which my family can't go back to. I think about the world in such a way of like, how do I act? How do I move here? I'm not wedded to the university and I'm not wedded to the museum. So conversations around reform or revolution are actually reactions to these things that you are somehow wedded to. I imagine the world to look very different. And it gives me hope, not the naive kind, but the kind in which you move in the world, in which you are surprised by the possibilities that it offers. Now, you can reduce a movement to a demand or not, but the work that went in there for months on end and generations before that to produce the kind of failures and successes, or for me to be in a room in which I argue for it to not be called Occupy, and to lose that argument after 500 emails to go back and forth around 99% or 1%. And to make that decision upon a movement that more is a rupture in time, that produces lessons to be learned, that is inextricable from the moment that we're in. I did that work. I didn't write it, I didn't read it, I made mistakes doing it, I made decisions that I thought were important. Is this art, do I care about MoMA? Oh, forget MoMA, fuck MoMA. Yeah, fuck it. What's the big deal? Again, what is this sense of like, what is so terrible about saying that? They don't care about me. Which art historians do they care about? Which artists do they care about? Why don't we talk about how there's an abolitionist show at MoMA? What does that tell us about an institution? What does that tell us about our complicity in it? What does that tell me about what you're doing? What am I doing? Why is it always that these institutions somehow have to frame the conversations that we're having? Why are our conversations always so boring? Reform, abolish, nonsense. We have different positions. Your question, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think the main thing around is, I mean, one of the things that we also, we're not outside of any of these systems, right? There isn't an outside. There isn't an outside, but then we can construct these outsides within not having an outside. I don't know if that makes any sense. Like, you know what I mean? Like, the moment you swipe your MetroCard, you're participating in an institution. The category of artists makes you create a bubble. Oh, that you're only dealing with art institutions, right? And that's separate from dealing with, let's say, MTA, which is the public institution, or the library, right? The library is then considered a higher place than let's say, art museum or whatever, right? It's these bubbles that we're against. It's about bursting these bubbles that exist, that as if the MTA is not equally important as, like, let's say MoMA in this context. And so we haven't really like differentiated between the MTA and the MoMA. We say fuck the MTA. We say that, the same thing.
And fuck the police.
And then why not say that to the MoMA? Like, why is that such a radical idea in terms of that? Because I mean, because it is important that we leave these institutions, right? And so the question around, like, reform and revolution, I'm not really sure, like, because I think, so for example, if you take the example of Occupy Wall Street, yes, it has been a failure, but what you see with what Bernie Sanders and, Elizabeth Warren have done comes straight from Occupy. Everything that they were fighting for, or anything that the democratic socialists in the country have been, like, kind of fighting, Occupy was doing all of that. Most of the people from Occupy went into, like, these are regular people that we knew, went into being like campaign managers for these people during the elections. So what has the ripple effects? We do not know. The main thing is that we need to keep moving based on what we think struggle means and what freedom means for us, and work within those paradigms, because the shifts will happen, the ripples will happen. People are talking about diversity now, right? They're talking about diversity and inclusion now. There's texts on we're in the decolonial turn, blah, blah, blah. Like, October has a whole issue on decolonization, and it'll continue to happen. Like, these fashions will keep coming in and going. But I think it's really important to remember what is the core of our struggle, right? And for us, it has always been like I was always mentioned, there isn't a debt you can pay for reparations. There isn't a debt you can pay for the harms, but we can work towards desire. We've been hurt so much, we've been traumatized so much, that even in building these relations, the work that is needed to sustain them, the care that is needed to even build these against the whole system that is willing to destroy these relations in itself is a task, right? To be able to even come together under these circumstances is a task. And so for me, when I think about the Whitney or the MoMA, I'm not interested in them because, oh, look, I need to go save the Whitney, or like, I can't save anything, let alone even myself, right? So for me, what's interesting is like what they offer for me is a place where we can come together and say, that shit is screwed up. I do not want that. Yes, this should go. But what am I creating? What is the future that I'm enacting? What is the present that I'm enacting at that particular moment? And I might not know that today, but I know that at least I can wake up to that possibility tomorrow and work towards that and learn from it and fail and then move. But as long as I have my own values and I'm accountable to a community, I can work those through. So yeah, I mean, for me, solidarity is also a moving term. It's not a fixed position. None of these positions are fixed. Neither is freedom, neither is decolonization, neither is abolition. What abolition means today could mean something else tomorrow, right? Because we would have learned by practicing it and failing at it.
I'm interested in, I'd like to talk a little bit more about FTP as a project. And I'm wondering if you see, has there been a transition in your practice between dealing with, say, art institutions like Whitney, American Museum of Natural History, removing monuments, decolonizing the museum, and more, and now MoMA, the Brooklyn Museum, and moving to, say, police and the MTA. Those are, in some ways different institutions. You might argue that they're continuous on a spectrum with, institutions of discipline and control, part of the larger racial and colonial capital project. But I'm interested in maybe you could say some more about FTP. And I like how FTP has a negative aspect to it in terms of fuck the police, but also a positive one in terms of like feed the people or free the people, or however you want to define it. I'm wondering about the language also of profanity, and if that is like, how does that work strategically? Does that create barriers, as I imagine it would, with certain kind of would-be liberal sympathizers, or is that not of interest to you strategically anyway? So maybe you could say a little bit more about FTP as an ongoing project.
I think after years of working, again, I mentioned this is why it's important from where we started. With Occupy, the lesson that we learned is that often things that are done can be easily dismissed as confrontations with the police, protesters versus police, and a lot gets lost. So museums, a community to which we belong to as artists, then we're not in this problematic positionality. Right, and then we took lessons around internationalism, lessons around which the Occupy wasn't, and the intersectionality of oppression and struggle, and then tried to see, we got invited to participate through Gulf Labor, and then we said we want to do a solidarity initiative, and so we kind of did that. Once you do that, you realize you learn another lesson, which is just like human rights as a framework doesn't work for the kind of things that we think are necessary. And that's just an experience, an experiment. So then you go from there, and then there's a show about Palestine, and then you're like, well, how do I approach this? Because it's deeply problematic. So it's a direct relation. And then you realize, well, all your friends are next door. So how do you deal that? And you realize you have to organize. The point is that the walls of the museum are fictitious, so why adhere to them? Its impact of the museum is actually for the 1%, so on the board, so then why do they're having cocktails. So I think there's a class dimension to this that is often not noticed. It's hidden under the fact of artist as an identity. I don't know what that is. I know there's a class position as well, right? There's a class position that isn't an artist. An artist isn't a class position. So what is that? What is that class position that you're inhabiting? Now you can talk about radical politics and do all these things. So those are contradictions in which we heighten. We heighten contradictions, not to isolate, not to eliminate, but to heighten, because heightening contradictions then allow for the types of conversations that you need to have in order to build something different. that isn't in relation to the thing that you want to not exist. Then you say, okay, you have all these people that actually have never been into the museum, but we're struggling with them in relation to the MTA, and they're beating down kids, saying POC spaces and diversity isn't the issue. We know that. All right, so then what do you deal with anti-Blackness? And what responsibility and role do you have? You know what responsibility and role we decided we have? We have to go back against the police. And when we went back to against the police because our friends asked us, we said, here's everything that we built in service of that movement that doesn't exist, but we're going to call for a thing. Okay, so then you call for a thing, and here's all the lessons that you learn: no permits, autonomous organizing, you know, diversity of tactics. You bring all these things to bear that you almost, the museums were training grounds for this stuff. Now, why fuck the police? Fuck the police because the neighborhoods say it, and they don't even need to say it, they know it. I don't need a paper to tell me fuck or not fuck. As a matter of fact, talk to Fred Moten and he'll tell you, forget MoMA, forget the Whitney. What is he saying when he says that? Fuck MoMA, fuck the Whitney. In fact, forget comes before fuck. So the idea of forgetting becomes part of the idea of being able to imagine. Are we into the kind of politics of respectability? Fuck respectability politics. Is this something that I want to write a dissertation about that gets published in a book at an Ivy League school? No, fuck the Ivy League school. There's not much that needs to be said about this. What needs to be said is the work that people are doing. And writing shit is only a small part of it. The question is whether you engage. And if you're engaged, who are you engaged with? And if it's from the same crew, then you're not doing the work. Because the thing needs to be built. That's why we said, fuck the police. And that's why we did the thing. For us, it's about liberation. It's about freedom. It's about building the spaces that are necessary and doing the things that we think need to be done. Now, was I investigated by the FBI and is that an open file? Yes. So you want to tell me what kind of price do you put on the work that's being done? You take risks. If your shit is comfortable, you're not doing enough. Period. And we should say that, not out of a place of a position. It's out of a place of just like, okay, an acknowledgement of where we're at and what we need to do. And that's cool. We got to do what we got to do. No one's going to judge anyone. We shouldn't. But it's crazy the level of armchair kind of thinking about this when our the goodness that we have requires all of us to materialize. So now why are we thinking about other spaces and other places? Because shit got too hot. Because what people should be thinking about was, why did the George Floyd moment get so co-opted so quickly? And why were just cop cars burning the first week? And who was policing them to not do that? And how many times were people silenced in the streets when they said, fuck the police? And who did it? And what was the role of the Ford Foundation in it? Why aren't people asking that question? Why aren't we asking questions? Why don't that lead to better questions?
Yeah, I think, I mean, that makes so much sense when you consider the larger framework of, if we understand life today as a life living through an ongoing catastrophe of world destruction, of the ongoingness of, again, structural racism, genocide, the genocide of the more than human ecosystem, the destruction of the world as we know it. How can one possibly live in any situation of comfort at the same time? How can we not engage and begin with understanding our own complicity and positionality within it? I think that all absolutely makes total sense. How are you both on time? Do we have time for one more question? So one last question about internationalism and the necessity for internationalism, which often can be very challenged from political struggles in the States. So in your recently published Decolonial Operations Manual, Again, you can download this on Decolonize This Place's website, also on Beyond the End of the World's website. So it's an amazing, free, accessible publication on Amin and Natasha's practice and the
practice of a lot of our friends, yeah,
and more and the collective that they are, that they represent, that they're part of. So in decolonial operations, you write this: as the ideological seams of empire are torn apart and settler democracy melts down before our eyes, we aim to kindle an international imagination of anti-national and anti-imperialist feelings, an IIAAF that shares colonial wounds, but is driven by freedom dreams, from Puerto Rico to Punjab, Palestine to Turtle Island. This is amazing. Can you say more about the IIAAF and the role of affect or emotions, and what hope you see for such an international imagination? And how can we, all of us, help to realize it, either with your struggle as accomplices and in solidarity, or in our own places, wherever we are?
Net, you take this home from the farm.
I mean, you know, if you were in India right now, and if you were a farmer who was standing on this, you know, was on the border, resisting just mainly land grab around your land, you would be called an anti-national, right? Like that's the kind of level of threat that any practice of freedom is posed right now in this world. And it's not, you know, I mean, India, of course, you're seeing it. Egypt, you can see, you know, what's happening. I mean, any of these places, even the US, right? Like the kind of, you know, threat that exists from even imagining what it could mean living outside any of these systems, and to be able to push for that, and capitalism really at a mass scale just taking up all these resources, right? That any active imagination ends up becoming a threat. And so and then is framed into anti-nationalism, like specifically I think for the case of Punjab, right? It's gone into like, you're terrorists, there's violence, you know, always these kind of tropes are brought in to then be like, oh, you're an anti-national. And then that's when you say, yes, I am an anti-national, because I am for an anti-national, which is an international, right? Because what does it, like, for example, what does India even as a nation state even mean, right? When we have histories of colonization here, not just from the Britishers, but from before, right? And that's, I think that's something that exists for any of these places, Middle East, you know, the United States. And so I think the kind of anti-national, international feeling is we have to build this kind of thinking which moves beyond thinking within the model of nation states. And I think that I mean, it's kind of amazing how much we've seen that. I mean, of course, it's a possibility that, you know, people can't even imagine thinking outside of like traveling, let's say, even without passports or things like that. But even in terms of relationality, we have so many differences. Class is a major one, majorly the difference between the Western world and the rest of the world and the resources. But apart from that, I think the last thing I would say is we haven't talked about climate change, or we haven't talked about climate at all. But you know, from the extraction that has happened from centuries, the debt is being paid by the global South, right? Where are you seeing most of the disasters happen, the floods happen? Where are you seeing wars happen? Where are you seeing societies being torn without even a second of news clips showing up anywhere, or even a second of concern? Right. So I think that's also really where it comes from, is to kind of, you know, weigh the scale a little bit to the other side as well. Right. It's not just about the crisis that the West is dealing with. It's a crisis that has existed for a really long time. And I think we need to acknowledge that the kind of response to that crisis has to be a structural one, but it also has to be on an international level. But also at the same time, I feel like words like global, international, earth, climate change, all of these terms are so overused and have failed us right? And I think that's where the role of affect comes in. And I think, just to answer Mustafa's question again, solidarity also has failed us in terms of that, right? Because it has become a term which has been fixed by NGOs. It has been fixed in it to retain its certain narrative. So has climate change. So when words, language, these feelings that they generate have failed us, I think it becomes a responsibility, definitely as artists, but also as just people living life, to be able to imagine something different, something more meaningful, something more that even I can associate with. And I think this is just something, we've been writing and just trying to think about, is how do we move beyond the failure of our own imagination, failure of language, and then construct feelings that we can kind of at least have. Hope is like, I don't even know, I can't even talk anymore. Any word that I use just like goes back into the same thing. But yeah, I think that's it. And I think care, I'll just stick to the idea of care. And I think we really need that kind of work.
I think also the profanity allows for the pivot, and it allows for the recognition. It unsettles normativity. It's something Angela Davis, refers to, like the idea of unsettling normativity. It's not about what's legal and what's not. It's not about like it's thinking about like, how are things transgressive? How do they challenge power as a byproduct of doing something else simultaneously? That's the thing that kind of is of interest. And in terms of the, we read a statement that Fred Moten had written about Palestine that was the basis for which he was in support or came out in solidarity of the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement. And he talked about the anti-national insurgent feeling, the anti-national insurgent feeling. And so that kind of in line with our practice and what we've seen in the world, how can it be, and it needs to be more accessible for us. So how can it, in terms of who he's speaking with, so how can it be an anti-national, international feeling, right? But yeah, I mean, I think, I think it's also about knowledges, and it's about lived experience, and it's about putting the puzzle together about what's happening to us and how, so we can figure out how to break free out of it. And if we operate within the nation state, or we operate within the city, not that you don't, but you operate on multiple levels simultaneously, and it's possible. It's your orientation and your compass. For us, Palestine's our compass. For me, maybe Palestine is my compass. But that doesn't, Palestine isn't free if we're not all free. You know what I mean? So I think like there's this deep commitment to each other and to each other's freedom and each other's possibility that requires a relinquishment of control, and requires a redistribution of privilege. And it requires you to work from where you are in relation to the position you inhabit. The thing that people should be asking themselves is, how am I complicit? And then in the process, how do I have agency and responsibility? We've been able to do a lot of things because of where we work. Some would call that the undercommons. Some would call that class traitor. Some would, whatever it is that you want to call it. There's ways in like, stop wringing your hands and start figuring out how do you do and move more intelligently. And if you say you're resisting, ask yourself, are you resisting effectively? Because sometimes the best kind of thing you can do is stop doing the shit and taking up the space and let others do, if only breathe.
I mean, one last thing I would say, I mean, specifically around, Jasbir Puar says that Palestine, I mean, she said that in 2016, Palestine's coming for all of us, right? So I think to think that what's happening in Palestine is not going to come for all of us is the kind of myth that one needs to break. We were talking about technologies, any technologies, be it military, surveillance, educational, all of that, like Israel is leading in terms of that. And so like, I mean, we've already heard about Zoom panels being shut around Palestine. Facebook already kills pages in Palestine. Google does not acknowledge Palestine exists. So it's endless, right? And you see that happening even, with for example, our Instagram, we've gotten shadow banned several times. So, I mean, none of this is separate. These technologies are, they are practiced and experimented somewhere and then brought to us in some one way or the other, right? That's just one example of like, thinking that, if we, our, freedom is collective or non-existent. And so I think it's important to think that, oh, that person over there, right? What they're going through cannot come over to me only if I associate it with this particular system, right? And I think that's also why this kind of anti-national, international feeling is really important, is again, because of the same thing. We're going to get screwed. We're going to get screwed. We are, but we are going to get further.
خلاص net.
You telling me that?
Yeah.
But we're also all going to resist it as well, and together. Natasha, I really like what you were saying, and I mean, but Natasha, what you were saying about climate change. I'm thinking a lot about that, and I completely agree that we not only it's as if we're in the situation where we not only have to struggle against the disaster of climate change, but also how climate change is conceptualized through this extremely narrow language of climate change. So we have to do that work as well, because it's like what you write in relationship to the rhetoric of diversity, equity, and inclusion. If it's not actually transforming systems, then what's the point? It's actually buttressing those very systems that are producing violence and not really transforming at all. So anyway. I need to wrap it up because we're running out of time, and I knew we wouldn't cover everything or complete, finish the conversation. It can only end with to be continued. But I think, so much came up. Thank you so much for sharing, all your thoughts and your engagement and your passion, and so much to think about and look into more. All of these projects that Amin and Natasha talked about, you can find lots of material online, and through their Instagram account, and through their booklet and voluminous writings. So I encourage everyone to look at their practice more, and to think about all their engagements and ways that we could, amplify it and develop it further through our own engagements. So I've learned a lot. Thank you so much for sharing all this with us, and take care.
Thank you so much, Steve. Thank you for having us.